Greetings. Good evening. Welcome to the gutter. Everyone ends up here eventually. It's only a matter of time. For those of you venturing forth into the gutter for your first time, welcome. I hope you enjoy my attempt to simply host the type of show I would enjoy watching. Normally, I would try to have a guest on to share with me in the topic du jour. However, no guest this evening, so it's just I, your host, Aldist.
Just me, baby. Just me.
And this is not a result of poor scheduling or the cancellation on the part of a guest, as has been the case in the past. No, for tonight, from the moment I actually started this little show, I had this particular date blocked out for an extremely personal reason. In addition to the holiday weekend this past week, there was an anniversary of sorts. Well, actually, multiple anniversaries. The first being the celebration of my birth. The fifth, and more importantly, perhaps in many contexts, the fifth anniversary of the passing of one of my personal heroes, Mr. Steve Ditko. You see, I truly and unequivocally love comics, the stories, the art, the medium, just about everything about them. From reading to collecting to talking about them, I find them, much like my other passions of old-time radio and pulp magazines, to have a distinct Americana flavor about them. And this being our most recent 247th celebration of the birth of the United States, I was reflecting a bit on the uniqueness of that very quality with my son. And as we were sitting there on the dock, our feet in the water at the family cottage, explosions of light, carrying on overhead in a magnificent celebration of blowing shit up and freedom. The uncompromising nature of liberty hit me in the moment, kind of like a thunderbolt. And reflecting on that and the topic that obviously months earlier I had allotted for tonight's show, I thought that would be an excellent theme around which to frame this, or for that matter, any discussion on Mr. Ditko. And that one word that frames this thought, this embodiment of both liberty, freedom, and personal ethos that digs to the very heart, that is what is both at the source of America and Steve Ditko's himself's amazing contributions to both the medium of comics and culture in general, is simply one word. And, in today's world, it's almost decried as being a slur, the character trait of the stubborn or the backward thinking. Obviously, for anyone that has not only listened to this show, but knows a little bit about my own outlook on this crazy world we live in, knows that I certainly can't concur with those sentiments, because the word is quite simply uncompromising. Uncompromising to your principles, uncompromising to the demands that are placed upon yourself to always deliver the highest quality work you possibly can. To put it another way, in any compromise between food and poison, it is only death that can win. There are no compromise on matters of knowledge, truth, or rational conviction. And this is at the heart of Steve Ditko himself. And through this lens, I hope to look through his amazing contributions in comics tonight. A word of warning, though, I as I said in the chat, I have gone way overboard on my research on this. And this will probably end up just being part one. I highly doubt we'll even get to 1968. That being said, let me hop over and greet the chat a little bit here. We've got first post goes to Odin Dasko. Odin Dasko, obviously, former guest here on the gutter. Good evening, Aldous. Artists with last names that start with a D and end in KO are usually pretty cool. I can't disagree with you on that. And Eric Grant immediately renames himself to Eric Draco. And, well, he should, because that's a good name. My fellow co-host over on Jeremy's channel for the From streams, Jeremy, Ice and Fire, great to see you, sir. The great Ditko indeed. Jason Sandberg, another former guest, great to see you, sir. Good evening to yourself. Mad Ruth, another former guest, great to see you as well. Happy Wombular escape, all this. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And then, of course, good evening, Jason Sandberg and Mad Ruth. So now that everybody's greeted each other, we can all move on into probably a little bit more of the content that you've all come here for. But 5 years hence his passing of this mortal coil, the world is a lesser place without Mr. Ditko's presence. However, one fact does remain. He is the embodiment of standing by your principles over every other temptation or desire, as I kind of led into with my opening. And tonight, we're going to delve a little bit into the philosophy that guided Mr. Ditko to such admirable heights. We'll talk about the man whose public persona was all about the art, he said, and nothing else. Because for Ditko, the art he produced was all you needed to know about him. In one of his last interviews, he's quoted as saying to Mike Howell for the Marvel main fanzine, when I do a job, it's not my personality that I'm offering the readers, but my artwork. It's not what I'm like that counts, but what I did and how well it was done. Refreshing words in this modern realm of hubris and personal aggrandizement from creators across the spectrum, I must say. Also, it speaks volumes about those who follow the traditional comic tropes of labeling him a recluse or crazy old creator who just couldn't get along with anybody. He's laying it all out right there for what it means, and it's just whatever you take away from it. So on November 2nd, 1927, in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, Mr. Steve Ditko was born to a second-generation Rusnik Byzantine Catholic immigrant family. Basically Slovakian by today's standards. His father, Stefan, or the Americanized Stephen, from which his name was sourced, was an extremely talented master carpenter at the local steel mill, while Anna, his mother, was a homemaker. She stayed home and raised the kids, as was tradition at the time. He was the second oldest. He was preceded by a sister, Anna Marie, and followed by another sister, Elizabeth, and his brother Patrick, to which he was still close, remained close to his whole life. And it was here in these formative early years where a deep love of comics was instilled within the core of Mr. Ditko's young mind. And part of it, a large part of it, had to do directly with his father. His father's deep love of the newspaper strips of the day, specifically something that we've talked about on this channel, and that was Hal Foster's Prince Valiant. And additionally, as he grew up a little bit, the debut of Bill Finger and Bob, the Human Xerox Machine Kane's Batman in 1939, and then Will Eisner's The Spirit in 1940, Mr. Ditko dove headfirst into a deep fascination and love for the medium, and his mind was soon made up, even as a young lad. He was firmly and convinced that he was going to make comics in his life, and that's what he wanted to do. And it is it's really important to note here for me as a father and to bring to the attention of all those with children, time and time again, when we're talking about greats within the comic space, we find that the love for the medium was instilled at a younger age, and usually by one or other of the parents. Jim Steranko talks often about how his mother would read him old comic pages, and that's how he learned how to read, and that's where his love for him came from. And here with Mr. Ditko, it was his father's love of Prince Valiant, and he adopted that father's love. Or in the instance of being exposed to that passion of reading along, it's something to chew on at the very least as we watch the appreciation for this medium to dwindle for each passing year. And it's something to self-reflect on as we engage with our own children in whatever pursuits we may have of reading with them and showing them what we appreciate. But that being said, during his time in high school in Johnstown, and this was his yearbook cover for his senior year in 1945, his artistic talents were very well present, but expounded upon in different ways other than drawing. He was a member of both the science club, but more specifically, he spent a lot of time working in a woodworking workshop that was devoted to carving model planes for the aid of training the plane spotters that were being trained towards the end of World War II. And here is his high school yearbook picture. He's there all the way on your bottom right. And so during that time, he's in high school. He really didn't know what to do, but he definitely has to join the military. So upon graduating high school, Mr. Ditko enlists in the United States Army in October of 1945, almost exactly 1 week before his 18th birthday. And he was immediately shipped off and served in Allied occupied Germany. And while there, he started drawing like sketches and comics a little bit for the Army newspapers and bulletins. And despite my searching, I could not find any samples of that. So I do apologize. But I was able to come across this. Here's a picture of Sergeant Ditko during his time in the U.S. Army. It is known from the family accounts of his letters home that he was constantly drawing and honing his craft. Often not just mentioning it in his letters, but sending samples of little strips back home. And of minor note, during this time, he did produce his first monthly comic, at least for a very short period of time, albeit to an audience of one. It was mailed to his brother Pat. And by the close of 1949, Mr. Ditko was honorably discharged and left the service and returned to Johnstown. There, he would do odd jobs. Here, he's painting the letters on the gymnasium steps. And he really, I'm not going to say he floated, but he kind of didn't know where to go. And while he was back, he soon found out that one of his heroes, a Mr. Jerry Robinson, we need to talk about Jerry Robinson. So a bit of background on Jerry Robinson. Robinson was hired by Bob Kane to be the original secondary inker and letterer for Detective Comics in 1939. And by the end of 39, Robinson had progressed so quickly in his ability that he eventually became the primary inker for the Batman books, with George Russos only doing some minor background inking on a couple of pages. So in early 1940, during discussions between Finger and Kane regarding giving Batman a sidekick, it was actually Robinson that suggested Robin as the name for the sidekick, because he was inspired by the old Robin Hood stories that were illustrated by none other than N.C. Wyeth, that he read as a boy. N.C. Wyeth, of course, being a notoriously famous illustrator. And then by the spring of 1940, he worked with Bill Finger to create the Joker. So Mr. Ditko's admiration here, given the longevity and renown of those two characters, was extraordinarily well placed. So in any case, Mr. Ditko found out that Robinson was teaching at the Cartoonists and Illustrators School, which is now the School of Visual Arts in New York City. And so the change of the calendar from 49 to 1950 saw Mr. Ditko. He moves to New York, and he quickly enrolls using his GI Bill. And Robinson, much later in life, would be quoted as saying that he found the young Ditko, quote, a very hard worker who was very focused on his drawing, who was able to work well with writers as well as write his own stories and create his own characters. And that's some high praise, given what Robinson himself had accomplished over the past decade. And it was also during this time that, upon invitation from Robinson, a young editor from what was then Timely Comics, the entity that would eventually become Atlas and then eventually Marvel, was brought in to speak to the class. And it was on this day, and unfortunately the date is lost to both fate and time, that Stan Lee would first meet and see Steve Ditko's art. Now, one of Ditko's fellow classmates, who is both famous and kind of notorious in his own right, was Eric Stanton. And Eric Stanton would become fast friends with Mr. Ditko. And from about 58 until 68, they shared a studio space. And Stanton is a rather ribald fellow compared to the straight-laced Ditko. And in a way, Stanton would kind of serve later as a gateway of sorts for Mr. Ditko into the underground. For Eric had dedicated his own artistic pursuits to that glorious and unsavory avenue known as the underground scene that we discussed just a few scant weeks ago. And Stanton's work, it should be noted, was extraordinarily risky for the time. It delved into BDSM and the fetish scene, and even more ungodly for the time, it mostly dealt with female dominance persuasionary art. So to say that Mr. Ditko and Eric were an odd couple of friends putting it mildly, doesn't go far enough, especially given the philosophy that would come to be so warmly embraced by the former. So by the start of 53, Mr. Ditko is he's entered the professional comic book scene. He's graduated from the school and he gets a job. And his first actual professional work is to pencil Bruce Hamilton's science fiction story Sketchy Things for Strandmore Publications. And this would actually not see publication until Fantastic Fears #5 in February of 1954. But due to its delay, it was actually a short story paper romance in Daring Love #1 from October of 1953 by Key Publications Gilmore Magazine with a rather salacious cover, if I may say so. I don't know if I thought I uploaded it, but apparently I didn't. So that one's on me, boys. Sorry about that. But whether it was the fact that they saw something in those issues or it was simply the word of mouth due to his talents, working with Robinson at the Cartoonist and Illustrators School, it was not long after that that Mr. Ditko found gainful employment with two other eventual giants of comics, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. And he starts off as an inker, but it didn't take long for Mort Meskin. And let me go over who Mort Meskin is. So Mort Meskin he was originally the founder of National Comics, and a virtual legend in and of his own right in this time and space. Um, and Ditko had looked up to Mort and admired his work throughout his childhood in the mid 50s. And in fact, Ditko is quoted as saying Meskin was fabulous. I couldn't believe the ease with which he drew. Strong compositions, loose pencils, yet complete. Detail without clutter. I loved his stuff. And that's a rare explosion of expression in what is usually very stoic styled quotations from the man. So this meant a lot to him. And his work for Simon and Kirby spanned a wide variety of issues, but he stuck to Mort like glue. And Mort kept him there for a lot of reasons. He saw the talent. And so he provided a lot of inks for Mort during that time, but he also gained the opportunity to expand his talents a little bit. He penciled and inked his own 6-page story, A Hole in His Head, for Black Magic #3 in December 1953. And fortunately, I do have those. So this was Black Magic #3, and the cover artist I couldn't pull up for the moment, but I do have scans of the pages. Now, these are not my pages of my issue because my issue looks a whole lot more ragged than this, but I was able to find these. And this at least gives you an idea of early Ditko. This is as early as it almost gets, and these are fantastic. Again, you're seeing trends here that you're going to see much later. If you look at his use of color, if you look at his use of shadow, you'll also notice that he's not afraid with breaking or violating panel borders with other gutters. He's not stuck in a 9-panel grid. He's playing, he's experimenting, he's learning. Now, there's always going to be the claim when you're talking about stuff of this era that it is simply too wordy. And I could not disagree more. Comics, first and foremost, are a visual medium, but you still have to tell a story. And literacy rates at this time in the 50s were extraordinarily much higher than they are now. So people didn't want to look just at pretty pictures. They actually wanted an encapsulated good story. And so that's why you see what you see. And by the way, gentlemen, don't ever let ugly pimples ruin your looks. That's an excellent, excellent recommendation. So, in what would become kind of sort of a repetitive pattern, which is, and that's putting it lightly, of not staying in any one place for any length of time, it was shortly thereafter. Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot going into this, but yeah, he took a job at Carlton Comics. And it's a company that he would return to many times over the next 20 odd years. And there at Carlton, there was even more creative freedom and a lot less of what was to be, let's say, a very heavy-handed editorial team in the near future at his next stop. But there was less even than he had with Simon and Kirby. And there he provided a cover for The Thing number 12. And this was technically his first published cover anywhere. And this was in February of 1954. And in addition to that, he also supplied an 8-page story entitled Cinderella in the same issue. Now, Carlton was kind of renowned at this time as, I mean, their primary business was they printed, I think, sheet music. So the comic division, the magazine division was a much secondary thing. So they were a lower end publisher, and you certainly wouldn't know it though by the prolific level of work that Mr. Ditko puts out, because in less than a year he churns out 170 pages and 19 covers. All of this in the strong focus of pre-comics code horror stories that were all the rage at the time. And his rate may well have escalated further the next year. However, two things happened. First, in late 1954, the Comics Code is dropped. And number two, even before the Comics Code drops in mid 1954, he's struck down with a case of tuberculosis. And during his recovery, he goes back and he lives with his parents, and his mother, Emma, takes care of him. And his recovery from this took over a full year. And by the time he returns to the industry as a whole, it's completely changed. Hurricane Diane earlier that year had completely taken Carlton out of operation due to damage at their facilities, and returning to the industry that was now notoriously under the Comics Code Authority saw diminished opportunities as the market had shifted completely. So one opportunity that did reveal itself, and again, lost to time, we will never know whether it was due to that meeting 5 years earlier or not, was a position at Atlas Comics, which Mr. Ditko accepted. And so, stepping right into the scene, as it were, he went right to work on Journey into Mystery and World of Suspense, among others. And for the next year, Mr. Ditko's output would again continue to impress, with his page rate continuing to exceed all expectations. And at this time is when he's sharing a workspace, a studio, with his friend from Eric Stanton, and here he is at his studio. This is in 1959. One thing you will always notice in a lot of pictures of Ditko around his work table, you'll always see a note somewhere that says "Think," and that's something to reflect on much later as we get into some of the trials and tribulations that would occur within his professional career. And so, following some cutbacks at Marvel after his first year there, Mr. Ditko again returns to Carlton. But by 1958, he's only there for a couple of months. Stan Lee reaches out and he again returns to Atlas, working for both companies intermittently. He kind of bounces through them throughout this period. But by 1960, Ditko's back at Carlton, and he's working with Joe Gill on the creation of Captain Atom for Carlton. Before he goes back over to Atlas Comics, now renamed Marvel Comics, and it's just the perfect confluence of events at this point. And due to some falling sales on an amazing fantasy anthology book, the publisher, the notorious Martin Goodman, had agreed with Stan Lee to try something different, and they were going to insert a superhero into the series to pick up sales. And so Stan initially went to Jack Kirby with the pitch, and Jack produced some stuff, but it looked, in Stan's words, it looked like Captain America. There was nothing unique about the character, and he wasn't sure if that's what he wanted. So he turned to Mr. Ditko. And so on August 10th of 1962, enter the cultural epoch that is Spider-Man. And as we know today, Spider-Man was an instant hit. And while Amazing Fantasy would be canceled, Mr. Ditko had finally stepped on the elevator to success. After almost a decade in the business, after bad luck and hard knocks and multiple job changes, and even being down over a year due to illness, everything finally comes together in one brilliant package. Unfortunately, it also involves Stan Lee. And as many creators over the next decades would discover, when it came to success with Stan, nothing was ever shared. But for the moment, things are riding high. And the following March, in 1963, the world welcomed Amazing Spider-Man #1. Penciled by Jack Kirby, inked by Steve Ditko, and colored by Stan Goldberg. From that epoch moment until July of 1966, 38 issues of Amazing Spider-Man would be drawn and plotted by Mr. Ditko. Far and away the most enduring success of his career, before or since. With a full run that extended all the way to 441 issues, plus annuals and specials, giant sizes, and reprints, until 2007, when Marvel ended the original book and finally relaunched it. Spider-Man was an institution. And also, with all due respect to the recently passed John Romita, it never hit the same tones ever again as it did with those first 38 issues. Mr. Ditko was a driving force, putting an amalgam of teenage angst and action and wit into a blender with just the amount of fun and well-crafted plot contrivances. The whole series was just simply magic. The youthful exuberance of Tobey Maguire's Yahoo splayed across the big screen as he swings on a web doesn't happen without Mr. Ditko's work here. The grounded view of a troubled and bullied adolescent, perfectly balanced with the exquisite storytelling from panel to panel. It's pure Americana, and it's uncompromising in its awesomeness. But like I said, unfortunately, in a story that's as old as time, when you're talking anything about Marvel Comics and Stan Lee, trouble emerged almost immediately, and to a large degree continues even to this very day, despite the passing of both of these gentlemen. Because in various accounts given over the years, longtime Marvel writer and editor Roy Thomas said that Lee and Mr. Ditko disagreed on just about everything two men possibly could. Politics, aesthetics, the time of day, the weather, you name it, they fought over it. By the last year of the collaboration, and I use that word so extremely loosely, they were not even speaking to each other. They were using go-betweens within the office to relay any messages they needed to. It had gotten that bad. Now, for anybody that doubts this, you can actually see this in the credits pages of the issues themselves. Stan, never being one to hide a grudge or pull a punch or let go a chance to take a shot at somebody. In Amazing Spider-Man #10, Mr. Ditko is cited as swinging Steve Ditko. By issue 27, he's scowling Steve Ditko. Some, if not all, of this animosity was certainly related to, well, it didn't help that, how do you put this? Lee attributed himself as the creator of Spider-Man in an interview. And that really got to Steve. And, well, you know what? In all true Smarvy fashion and with a smile, we can actually listen to Stan Lee's own account.
He had complained to me a number of times when there were articles written about Spider-Man which called me the creator of Spider-Man. And I had always thought I was, because I'm the guy who said, I have an idea for a strip called Spider-Man. Having an idea is nothing, because until it becomes a physical thing, it's just an idea. And he said it took him to draw the strip and to give it life, so to speak, or to make it actually something tangible. Otherwise, all I had was an idea. So I said to him, well, I think the person with the idea is the person who creates it. And he said, no, because I drew it. Steve definitely felt that he was the co-creator of Spider-Man. And that was really, after he said it, and I saw it meant a lot to him, that was fine with me. So I said, fine, I'll tell everybody you're the co-creator. That didn't quite satisfy him, so I sent him a letter. I put it in writing. To whom it may concern, this is to state that I consider Steve Ditko to be the co-creator of Spider-Man along with me, something like that. And I sent it to him and I said, you can show this to anybody you want to. And I found out that Steve still objected to that because he felt I used the word consider. I consider Steve to be the co-creator. Apparently he felt that wasn't definite enough. So at that point I gave up. I mean, we just, I haven't spoken to him or heard from him since, I don't think.
But do you yourself believe that he co-created it?
I'm willing to say so.
That's not what I'm asking you, sir.
No, and that's the best answer I can give you.
So it's a no then, really?
Pardon me?
So it's a no then?
No, I really think the guy who dreams the thing up created it. You dream it up and then you give it to anybody to draw it. I mean...
But if it had been drawn differently, it might not have been successful or a hit, I suppose.
Yeah, but then I would have had created something that didn't succeed.
That arrogance and smugness always gets me there at the end. That was just it. But in any case, if you're of the camp that, you know, what made Spider-Man great was the aspect that a kid gets bit by a radioactive spider and gains powers, more power to you. You know, I tend to agree with Mr. Ditko, as my utmost respect for him throughout this has shown. None of the kids that are reading these comics or hanging Spider-Man posters on their wall, playing with action figures, or dragging their parents to the eventual movies did so for any other reason than they were captivated with the way that Mr. Ditko brought Stan's idea to life. Now, Mr. Ditko did actually respond to this via a 2002 essay printed in Avenging World collection, dismissing both the gesture and the approach, and drawing attention to the considering portion of the statement, instead of simply stating he is the co-creator. And I'm a firm believer that both Stan Lee and Mr. Ditko were well aware of what each was saying and why. Lee made the statement not because he believed it, but just to appease. And in that, the world will always kind of wonder, at least I think so, for what could have been. Following issue number 38 of Amazing Spider-Man, Mr. Ditko resigned, uncompromising his principles. He stepped away. But that was 3 years into the run of Amazing Spider-Man. And the force that was Mr. Ditko during those years did not end with just Spider-Man itself. In July of 1963, within the pages of an anthology book, Strange Tales, issue 110, the Sorcerer Supreme would emerge. Dr. Strange himself. Here, and this is both interesting and should be noted, Stan Lee always attributed the idea of Doctor Strange to Mr. Ditko. And in a letter to the comic reader, published in issue 16 in 1963, stated, "'Twas Steve's idea," unquote. For what it's worth, I do have to respect the consistency of Stan sourcing the idea of as the creative force here. But Doctor Strange was indeed strange. It was almost a complete departure from everything else that Marvel was doing at the time. It was heady. It was trippy. It was a journey through mysticism and magic, interdimensional portals, disembodied spirits, demon realms, altered states, swirling vortexes of plasma. It's completely alien. And holy shit, did people eat this up. I mean, through this land, unlike anything seen before on comic pages, the Doctor was the reader's guide. And here again, we see Mr. Ditko's creativity firing on all proverbial cylinders, because despite all the psychedelics, the story, the character perspectives, the depth of the tales, it's all still there. In fact, it's at the forefront. And perhaps one of the greatest tragedies is that so many are unfamiliar with these early Strange Tales, Doctor Strange stories. But during his time at Marvel, despite Kirby's style being the defining one for the house, Ditko notoriously always held his own. In contrast to the muscular heroes with fantastic powers that Kirby drew, Ditko's heroes were lithe, bone and sinew, instead of bulging muscles. In place of Kirby's canonical crackle, Ditko wrapped things in heavy shadows that were bathed in inks and delicate line. For comic fans, 1963 to 1966 was definitely a golden age, albeit in the Silver Age. I probably could have phrased that better. But for Mr. Ditko, it was something more. He never specified the reason for his abrupt departure, and some of what was stated above is speculation based on the accounts of others, as I quoted Roy Thomas. But it should be noted that by the late 1950s, Mr. Ditko firmly had embraced the philosophy of Ayn Rand, known as objectivism, of which I should state I am a firm believer in as well. The philosophy on life is not one that rests easy on a conscience of an ardent believer when faced with the kinds of behavior Stan Lee was exhibiting. And it could also be simply stated that the two served different masters in their particular goals. Stan always served Goodman, the publisher. Ditko served himself and his art. Mr. Ditko's career would continue, obviously, following his leaving Marvel. But for the time being, and the sake, the length of this show, and a couple other things I want to get into, I think we want to pause here. But I do want to show you one thing before we close out, and that's a couple of letters and the most famous door in comics. And so when you talk about Ditko on Lee, I want to read this particular portion of a letter. And Stan may have had too many characters to handle. With so formula approach for everything. It seems with Doctor Strange, early Stan plots, stories about ghosts, haunted houses, etc. And he losing a consistent look, having someone else ink Doctor Strange. The ideas could be mine, but I had no real right to them when published. And it didn't matter. I was getting the experience freelancers don't usually get. Now he's talking about the fact that he doesn't care that Doctor Strange wasn't his. He just wanted the experience. I think that's telling, again, about the man. Another letter. Dear Peter, every new generation has its particular favorites. Comic books have been around before Spider-Man. There were a lot of favorites in comic books before Spider-Man. There were favorites in daily newspapers, strips, movies, movie stars, TV shows. Name two categories if there are a favorite, like the early westerns, science fiction heroes, etc. From every still photograph to silent movies, to talkies, to color, all type of favorites, with crime, romance, piracy, war, science fiction, western, it goes on, etc. Every generation will find its own heroes' favorites as usual. Yours are already in decline. Yours are already in decline. That's Steve's attitude. That's Mr. Ditko's that's the foundation principle. The hero is always in decline because whatever was the current favorite is gone. Because in an era where Mr. Ditko came from, the pulp heroes of yore were already gone and new heroes were emerging. And I would ask you to maybe ponder as you reflect and look at the current comic book stand, where are the new heroes? Because all we do is recycle the old ones. And maybe it is time, as Mr. Ditko says, to let these heroes die. Another letter. Dear Johnny, there's no let's talk about you. There's no topic I want to discuss with anyone. Regards, Steve Ditko. Now, I did say that there's a famous door I want to show you. And if you go to a lot of different venues within comicdom, you'll hear 1,000 different descriptors of who Steve was or what Mr. Ditko was like. But the one consistent fact is there was only one place that you could ever go to get a hold of Mr. Ditko, and that was to knock on this door. This is the door to his residence on the north side of New York. And 715 S Ditko it's probably one of the most famous doors in comics because many a letter went through that mail slot and was never responded to, and many a person spent hours knocking on the door with no answer. But that's part one of Steve Ditko. And I guess before we go, let me revisit the chat because I see we've had some people just stop by. Got Mad Ruth again. Hail Jason Sandberg. Aerith, great to see you. His unique artistic style and storytelling have left a lasting impression on the comic book medium. His imaginative visuals and intricate narratives continue to inspire and captivate readers to this day. I couldn't agree more, my friend. Jason Sandberg, the wants, wishes, needs, and demands of others are no reliable guide to one's life and well-being. Absolutely. Excellent quote. Odin Dasco, I never tire of you calling Bob Kane by his title. The Human Xerox Machine? Bob, the Human Xerox Machine Kane. And then we've got Jason Sandberg, the yin to his yang. Antoine Dennison, I always love seeing artists at their artboard wearing shirts and ties. Absolutely, man. It's a different era of class. Cover looks Kirby-esque. A lot of the stuff from Simon and Kirby does have that Kirby quality to it. Kirby was known to pencil and then have people ink over his stuff. Unfortunately, there's like a huge period of time where we just have no accreditation for a lot of those book pages. I think it's more our attention spans are more diminished. People actually enjoyed a good read back then. You know, and that's interesting. One of the facts that I always love rattling off is more books are sold every year, but fewer books are being read. So take that for what you will in accordance with your point that I do agree with. Only attractive pimples are tolerated. The thing, yes, yeah, his early cover was definitely good. He did all that with an oar. He did all that without an oar. It's Carlton. If I mispronounce it, I apologize. I have a bad habit. As a majority reader, I mispronounce a lot of stuff. Martin Goodman was not a good man. It depends on who you talk to. He always took care of Stan. If you're Jack Kirby, you might agree. The greatness is in the execution. Ideas are a dime a dozen, for sure. Ideas are a dime a dozen, indeed. Whoops. Good see. There you go. Yo, great to see you, Jay. Ditko, indeed. This is going to be part one. We made it up to really 66. I was thinking maybe we'd make it to 68, but we're going to stop here because there is something I want to play before we close everything out. You as well, sir. I believe that Ditko was a Randian objectivist. Yes, he was. He was a follower of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. And again, did not compromise ever on his beliefs. So with that all being said, I did want to close this out. And I know we didn't get to the creation of the character, but I think playing this, and this is about 5 minutes long. This is actually Steve Ditko himself speaking. I'm going to play this and then I'm going to close it out. So I'm going to wish you a good evening and thank you so much for coming. But I would encourage you to stick around and listen to this complete. It's something that's near and dear to my heart. And obviously it's near and dear to Steve's because Mr. Ditko rarely, if ever, did interviews. And this is something that he did put out. So on that note, I leave you with this.
Mr. A is based on Ayn Rand's theory of justice, on Aristotle's law of identity, his definition of man, and his view of art. Aristotle said that art is philosophically more important than history. History tells how men did act. Art shows how men could and should act. Art creates a model, an ideal man as a measuring standard. Without a measuring standard, nothing can be identified or judged, but everything can be measured. Disease and sicknesses are measured by a healthy organ or body. All measurement requires an appropriate standard. With it, one can measure down to atoms, up to the stars, and the changes in the character of a man. Aristotle defined man as a rational animal. Rationality is a potential that has to be actualized by choice and the right thinking method of logic applied to reason. The standard of measurement for all is a rational logical ruler. It objectively measures the rational and irrational thinking. A hero measures a man at his best in the worst situations. A hero is a man admired for his qualities or achievements and regarded as an ideal or model. Aristotle formulated the law of identity. A is A. A thing is what it is. It has a specific nature and identity. The truth cannot contradict itself and also be a lie. Mr. A's black and white card symbolizes the law of identity. It identifies the two moral potentials possible, the good and the evil, and by one's chosen action, the best or the worst potential can be actualized. The card is also a symbol of justice. For Ayn Rand, justice is objectively identifying a thing for what it is and treating it accordingly. No one gets the unearned. The innocent is not penalized, the guilty is not rewarded. The card is a refusal to violate the root of justice, the law of identity, by a gray compromise, a refusal to sacrifice the good to the evil or to accept any part of the evil as a greater good. Society has its admirable people, its heroes. They are found in all professions. But hidden by the complexities of society, they are not as clearly defined, not as understood, and not as effective model as a story with two opposing forces of right and wrong in a dramatic presentation, revealing the character's choices and actions that identify them and lead to a just ending where the hero and the right view of life wins. Early comic book heroes were not about life as it is, but creations of how a man with a clear understanding of right and wrong and more courage chose to act, even if branded an outlaw. He dispensed a better justice than a pervading legal moral one. He was a moral avenger. He was not like everyone else, not the average, the common, or the ordinary man. He was the exceptional one, the uncommon one, the one doing what others were unwilling to do, regardless of the opposition and consequences to himself. His success provided a better model. Through a hero, one could identify the foolish, the corrupt, and the guilty. A lead character can be better or worse than society's best model, and if a man with proven better qualities appears, then a new measuring standard for men and society is established. A hero is a model for everyone, but not everyone is willing to act at his best. A less demanding model, blending good and bad, is more comforting, easier to accept. For the self-flawed, an anti-hero provides a heroic label without the need to act better. A crooked cop, a flawed cop, is not a valid model of a good law enforcer. An anti-cop corrupts the legal good, an anti-hero corrupts the moral good. Both corrupt ideals. Both choose the flaw over the perfect. The perfect is identified and measured by what is possible to man. A perfect bowling score. A perfect response accepts the truth and rejects the lie. The perfect hero on principle says yes to a true identity and no to a contradictory one. Ruled by justice, he treats every identity as it deserves. He is the actualized potential for good in its purest form, a true moral measuring ruler. He is the most human and deserving of respect. Today's flawed superheroes are superior in physical strength, but common, average, ordinary in mental strength. Rich in superpowers, but bankrupt in reasoning powers. They are perfect in overcoming the flawed supervillains, saving the world, the universe, yet help us to solve their common, ordinary, average personal problems. It is like creating a perfectly physical adult with the reasoning limits of a 6-year-old. The creators of flawed ideals believe that no real difference exists between a flawed hero and a flawed villain. Both have some good and some bad in them, so they blend into a grayness, where no one is better than anyone else, and where the worst can justifiably claim that he is as good as gray as the best. If it is impossible to know what is true and to do what is right, then the flaw, the worst, will be the new standard of good. Man will be defined as a flawed, anti-rational animal, and all that corrupts and harms life will be the new virtues. Like deliberately flawed eyesight, where self-blindness is the ideal, anti-life behavior will be the new standard for living. The resentment against the perfect hero is a resentment against A is A, against the integration of truth and behavior, against the non-contradictory identity of a moral ideal, against reality and life's measuring ruler, a rational moral standard.
This is blood for blood and by the gallons. This is the old days and the bad days, the all or nothing days. They're back. There's no choices left.
still here? It's over. Go home. Go.